Fox News alert: two major U.S. Supreme Court decisions on the issue of same-sex marriage today, and some very different views already of what those decisions mean for this country. Brand new hour here of America Live. Welcome, everyone. I'm Megyn Kelly. First, the High Court striking down a key part of the federal Defense of Marriage Act. Now, gay and lesbian couples living in states that recognize their marriages will be eligible for the same federal benefits, from the tax code to trust and estates laws to immigration benefits, as straight couples. Second, the High Court declining to rule on the merits of California's same-sex marriage ban, known as Prop 8. That ruling effectively opens the door again for gay marriage in the nation's largest state. Joining me now with perspective, Richard Socarides, who's a former special assistant to President Bill Clinton and a marriage equality advocate, and Tony Perkins, who is the president of the Family Research Council. Richard, let me start with you to try to put in perspective what you believe happened this morning and how significant you think it is.
Well, I think it's enormously significant that a federal law, the Defense of Marriage Act, enacted almost 17 years ago, was struck down by the court, really in an important decision which basically says that in this country we cannot treat people differently based upon sexual orientation. I think it was a landmark decision, the ramifications of which will not be immediately known, but this case is going to be used for years to come as precedent in any situation where a law tries to treat people differently. That's number one. Number two, I think the fact that even though the court did not rule on the merits of Proposition 8, the fact that the net effect of its ruling is to return same-sex marriage to the country's most populous state, its most important state, its biggest state, I think the gay rights movement, the same-sex marriage rights movement, would appear unstoppable at this moment.
Most important state? California? Well, I take offense as a New Yorker. But I'll move on because we have more important issues to get to. Tony, your reaction.
Well, I agree in part that the ramifications will not be seen immediately. I take a kind of a different angle here when we look at California, because Ted Olson did not go to the Supreme Court to see them punt on this issue. What he went to the court to do was to impose a redefinition of natural marriage on the entire country. He failed to do that. So you still have 37 states that will have, once this works its way out in California, you'll still have 37 states that have either in their constitutions or statutes the definition of marriage as a union of a man and a woman. And I don't think time is on the side of those who want to redefine marriage, because those ramifications, the loss of religious freedom, where you have bakers and florists and photographers forced to participate in same-sex marriages. When the American public begins to see that, the loss of parental rights as their children are taught values that are inconsistent with what they're taught at home, and you see churches and religious organizations lose their tax exemption, I think Americans are going to pause and say, you know what, this is not what I gave a nod of affirmation to.
Richard?
Well, I think Mr. Perkins is really talking from an old playbook. I mean, I think everybody who is looking at this knows that the only thing that's going to be affected is civil marriage, the right of any citizen to go to City Hall and to get a marriage license. No church or religious denomination is going to be forced to do anything, especially with respect to marriage. And that, you know, the country is moving forward in a cultural sense with the acceptance of gay people. And I think that the most important message from the court's majority opinion in the DOMA case today is that discrimination against gay and lesbian Americans is over. You can no longer enact a law in this country that targets gays and lesbians, and the court will not find it constitutional.
What of that, Tony? Because some are already pointing to the dissent by Justice Scalia, who did not want to see this Defense of Marriage Act invalidated in part. And he is telegraphing that, in his view, it seems, the majority's opinion suggests they are willing in a future case to declare gay marriage a constitutional right, which would lead to its legalization in all 50 states.
That's if it gets to the court. Now, he 10 years ago actually signaled that overturning in the Lawrence v. Texas case, that would lead to same-sex marriage, even though the others denied it. So, I mean, I think you certainly have to pay attention to what Scalia is saying here. But the reality is that was not what the court decided today. And the idea that states can still it's very clear from the opinion today that states can still decide to determine that marriage is the union of a man and a woman.
It is,
so
but
that
let me
no
just
way
jump
was
in. I completely
whatsoever.
agree with you. That's very clear. In the states where gay marriage is not allowed, it's not allowed tomorrow, and it's not allowed the next day unless they change their laws. The Supreme Court didn't interfere with that. But could you speak to the point of this, of whether you believe the majority opinion has now telegraphed that the next gay marriage case to come up that actually asks the High Court to declare that gay marriage is a constitutional, a fundamental right that cannot be denied by any state? Do you think that's likely?
In reading through the opinion, of course, I think reading the opinion focusing most heavily on Kennedy's statements, it is uncertain. Because in part he says that states have a right to define marriage. He clearly says the federal government does not have a right to what it did with DOMA, but there's wording that he uses that does make it certainly open to interpretation, that a majority would overturn the other aspects of DOMA, not just the part pertaining to the federal government, but that pertains to the states as well.
Go ahead, Richard.
Mr. Perkins may wish it to be true, but the fact remains is that Justice Scalia, in his very angry dissent, disagrees with Mr. Perkins and says that what the majority opinion does today is pave the way for the end of any law which discriminates against someone in this country based upon sexual orientation. So while it is true that no state other than California is directly affected by the ruling today, what the court is signaling today is that it will no longer permit states to treat people differently based upon sexual orientation. I think that is the unavoidable conclusion, and they also ruled that the federal government has to recognize same-sex marriage is performed in states where it is already legal.
That's right. Go ahead, Tony.
There's still room in this opinion for the federal government, I think, as we're looking through this, for federal purposes only as it pertains to immigration and maybe in the military, to define marriage as a union of man and woman. So this is far from settled.
Well, that is absolutely not true. That is absolutely not true. And President Obama has already issued a statement since the ruling, which said very clearly that he is going to act swiftly and promptly to implement this decision,
Congress,
and that with respect to federal regulations,
these
marriages are going to be recognized. So, Mr. Perkins, you are correct that no state was ordered today to recognize same-sex marriages other than California, which is the biggest state. But you are incorrect when you suggest that there is still room for the federal government to treat same-sex couples differently. There is no longer any room for that.
Go ahead. I'll give you the last word, Tony.
Yeah, yes, there is. Well, there is. In Congress, there are members of Congress looking at that today. This is far from over.
Well, that is the essence of the decision. The essence of the decision is exactly the opposite of what you said.
Listen, I appreciate you both coming on. You've both been forceful advocates for your respective sides and respectful, and I appreciate that. Thank you both.